and hit send. Keep the drop-down option as all panelists. Today's presentation is Considerations for Management of Clinical Trials and Regulatory Filing Strategy in Light of COVID-19. Today's speakers are Demetrius Carter and Elaine Taylor. Demetrius is currently a Senior Vice President of Services Operations and Regulatory Services at Synchrogenix, a Certara company. He is globally responsible for their regulatory writing, submissions, and operations teams. He has more than 20 years of experience across the drug development spectrum. Joining Demetrius will be Elaine. Elaine Taylor is currently the Vice President of Regulatory Strategy and Policy at Synchrogenix, a Certara company. Her group provides global regulatory strategy, consulting, and submission support from early stage to post-marketing. She has more than 30 years of pharmaceutical experience, including developing and providing strategic guidance and regulatory advice at all stages of pharmaceutical product development. Demetrius and Elaine, welcome to today's event. I'll now turn it over to Demetrius to begin the presentation.
Thank you, Suzanne. And on behalf of Certara and the Synchrogenix team, we would like to thank everyone for your attendance at today's webinar. Over the next few minutes, I would like to focus on clinical trial operations and the wide-ranging impact that COVID-19 is having on pivotal studies. We will explore the issues that have arisen and identify some mitigating strategies and best practices that should be employed by the various stakeholders involved in the drug development process. By now, most of us have seen the impact that COVID-19 has had on the global economy, public health, and particularly the clinical development space. The headlines are littered with examples of how the spread of COVID-19 has negatively impacted the global drug development landscape. According to the Industry Association, Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America, there are currently more than 260 vaccines in development, with more than 70 of those as potential COVID-19 vaccines in the global pipeline. We applaud all of the agencies, sponsors, and investigators who are quickly working to develop therapies and vaccines to treat this pandemic threat. Certara continues to support our customers' discovery and drug development efforts during this time with scientific informatics, model and simulation, and regulatory software tools and platforms that inform, improve, and accelerate the process of bringing new COVID-19 therapies to patients. However, the impact of COVID-19 goes well beyond the infectious disease space and is currently impacting all clinical development activities. For instance, the team at Evaluate Pharma identified over 300 pivotal studies on clinicaltrials.gov that were at risk of being delayed or at worst at risk of never being completed. While the COVID-19 related delays will likely impact the launch and sale of these potential blockbuster drugs, the real impact of these delays are with the patients who may experience delayed access to these critical and novel therapies. We should also recognize that the clinical trial delays are not limited to any country or region, nor is it specific to any single therapeutic area. For example, in a recent data set published by Metadata Solutions, they compared global clinical trial enrollment patterns from March 2019 with those in March 2020. They looked across all countries and all therapeutic areas to assess the impact of COVID-19. As the year-over-year data suggests, there was a clear negative enrollment impact globally that was agnostic of the region. Interestingly, you can see a correlation between countries hardest hit by the pandemic and a drop in clinical trial enrollment. Those countries include the US, UK, Spain, Italy, France, China, and Japan, to name a few. Similarly, these delays were not limited to infectious disease studies only. These interruptions impacted a broad swath of therapeutic areas, with the most significant impact seen on endocrine, cardiovascular, CNS, and dermatology studies. What do these trial delays mean, and how do we navigate the complexity of addressing these new challenges? In the next few slides, we plan to share strategies stakeholders may employ to mitigate the impact of these delays for patients. For example, lack of access, safety monitoring, and logistical issues. For investigators, for example, managing competing priorities, compensation issues, and managing the local IRBs, and data integrity. For example, how do we manage source data verification in that environment, remote monitoring, and missing data points? So while the COVID-19 induced delays present operational challenges, we should remember that many patients are depending on access to these trials for cures or potential improvement in the quality of their life. Therefore, our priority should be on the health and safety of patients while balancing trial continuity during these unique times. The easy solution would be to advocate for the pause or termination of ongoing studies. However, we have to remember that many patients enrolled in clinical trials have access to new, novel, and innovative therapies. Both sponsors and investigators should continue to evaluate the risk-benefit profile of continued participation in the study. However, if termination of the subject is recommended, then there should be a plan to transition the subject back to the standard of care with their primary care physician. With COVID-19, you should also expect to see an increase in adverse events reporting with a corresponding increase in the use of concomitant medications. There needs to be flexible solutions so that these events can be captured under non-traditional means, given that patients may be outside of their next visit window. Protocol should consider AE reporting using things such as telephones, emails, text messaging, and other routes of communication with the investigator. With current limitations on subject access to clinical sites, novel arrangements will need to be made to collect safety labs using local laboratories to help inform PI decision-making about the continuation criteria for individual subjects. Another layer of safety monitoring may include implementing a data monitoring committee to review safety and efficacy data independently, or if there is sufficient data available, that DMC may also be able to perform a futility analysis to support whether or not the study will be able to differentiate primary and secondary endpoints. Even the patients at the forefront of our minds, we should also consider the impact that trial delays may have on clinical supplies. We recognize that investigation of medicinal product shipments have been impacted by shipping and logistical issues, as the shippers have been able to shift their focus on critical path activities for essential supplies to healthcare centers. We also know that local stay and shelter orders, patients may be limited in their ability to access sites and dispensaries. As a result, sponsors and sites should work together to look into alternative methods such as home delivery solutions or using retail outlets to allocate the investigational product. You should also be mindful that the circumstances lead to a decrease in overall adherence to the treatment protocol. Protocol deviations should be adequately documented and submitted to the IRB or to your ethics committee and the sponsor for review. Based on some of the regulatory guidance documents, which my colleague Elaine will explore in the next few minutes, the agencies are very much fully anticipating an increase in protocol deviations, but also expect that they are well documented, adequately reported, and outlined fully in the clinical study report. Indeed, the environment for principal investigators and other site personnel has changed drastically. As a reminder, most of these clinical sites spend the majority of their time treating patients and playing an active role in the local healthcare system. To meet the demand and extra effort that the pandemic is placing on this network, many site resources have been diverted elsewhere to address critical needs. We hear stories in the media on how research clinics are being repurposed to house the overflow of patients from hospitals. With these competing priorities, what strategy should we employ to keep clinical trials as part of their priorities moving forward? Sponsors should collaborate with the PI to craft a custom solution that works for their specific site and circumstances. Sponsors should look into engaging sites in virtual meetings to understand their unique challenges and needs. For example, some sites could benefit from additional or temporary study coordinator support. They should also consider engaging qualified sub-investigators who can assist with administrating study assessments in the absence of the principal investigator. There's also likely a significant upside from the implementation of or expansion of electronic tools such as clinical outcomes assessments, electronic consenting, and video conferencing services to perform telemedicine visits. An additional consideration for sponsors is the financial strain that current environment is having on clinical sites. Some people have described it as a need for clinical studies to actually receive a stimulus package, much in the way that the government is focused on boosting the economy. Many sites are highly dependent upon timely payment of their investigator grants. Delayed payments can have a cascading effect on on-site resources, study engagement, and the prioritization of activities for your clinical trial. Sponsors should review the clinical trial agreements with the individual site to assess whether contract modifications are required to reflect the new normal. Bridging or advanced payments should be considered to sustain and support sites during this intervening period until standard reimbursement cycles can be reinstated. Sites may also request additional patient reimbursement funds, right, to help defray above normal travel and incidental costs that may be incurred in light of COVID-19. Lastly, given the changing environmental landscape, ongoing risk assessment and competing priorities at the sites, increased submissions and communications with the Institutional Review Board or Ethics Committee are anticipated. Regardless of the sponsor's decision to continue the trial, the IRB or other internal review committees may pause the study if they believe the risks outweigh the benefits to the patients. Sites should strategize on how and when submissions to the IRB are made, if they are competing with other study submissions and priorities, and assuredly the IRBs are overwhelmed with submissions. In the event a study is being governed by a data monitoring committee, then sites should be prepared for accelerated data entry timelines and a timely resolution of data queries to support the analysis process. Most importantly, sponsors need to collaborate with sites to create the necessary flexibility to develop patient-centric solutions. So what does that mean for data integrity from that perspective, right? Another area of concern during this period of uncertainty is our ability to maintain the integrity of data collection, particularly in randomized controlled trials. Considerable efforts have been made to design and implement these studies that protect patient safety, but also to reduce the probability that any benefits or risks identified in the study occur due to factors outside of the experimental treatment. A randomized controlled trial also allows for proper intention to treat analysis, as true comparisons can be made based on before and after review of the population. This analysis is weakened when outcome data are missing or incomplete for members of the ITT population. Therefore, site sponsors, CROs must collaborate to preserve the quality of key efficacy and safety data points throughout the life of the study. One area of consideration is the review of source data by an independent monitor during this period. Traditional methods of performing on-site source document verification or review may have to be suspended given site closures and travel restrictions. Adherence to the clinical monitoring plan may also be challenging and require an amendment to reflect new strategies. When I covered in depth in today's discussion, risk-based monitoring strategies that combine both on-site and remote monitoring should be reviewed as realistic mitigation strategies. Particularly powerful during this period are centralized monitoring strategies that can detect signal changes in key measures of performance, safety, and efficacy. Sites and the centralized clinical monitoring should also work together on data entry and data cleaning efforts ahead of any new or revised interim analysis timelines. Key data points should be prioritized and the extra time should be allowed for the collection of source data. As a reminder, data could be coming from multiple sources external to the site, such as backlog hospitals and local laboratories in the COVID-19 environment. Lastly, it would be unrealistic and naive to believe that COVID-19 will not have an impact on your clinical data set. Given the increase in hospitalizations, the exacerbation of underlying conditions, adherence to the protocol will be a challenge. Also, there would be an increase in the number of subjects withdrawn due to stopping rules in the protocol deviations, PI discretion, or voluntary withdrawal. Sites and sponsors should work together to develop strategies to mitigate loss to follow-up subjects, including increasing contact frequency, leveraging home health services, and other third-party vendors' experience in subject and data recovery. Of note, the statistical analysis plan should also be reviewed and simulations run on the potential impact to the ITT population and primary and secondary endpoints. As a result of these SAP changes, the protocol should be amended to reflect the new sample size and changes to the statistical methodology and to address any systemic protocol deviations being seen in the study. So to recap, we have discussed some of the issues and risks associated with clinical trial management as we are currently dealing with the reality of COVID-19. Patients are facing very difficult decisions regarding their continued participation in clinical trials. How do we overcome supply chain challenges that may inhibit the availability of investigational products? The increased burden on principal investigators and their site staff, given they are on the front line of fighting against COVID-19. We're dealing with the new reality of compliance challenges and protocol adherence, given logistical and environmental constraints. Actively managing data integrity issues through close collaboration and the use of tech-enabled tools and renewed efforts to retain and engage subjects throughout the study life cycle. While the environment is rapidly evolving, we are still involved or share responsibility to protect patient safety while expending the advancement of science and bringing new therapeutics to the marketplace. How can Synchrogenix and Certara help mitigate these challenges? As alluded to earlier, we offer an opportunity for experienced scientists that can assist with in silico modeling and the simulation of various scenarios. If you're thinking about redesigning your protocol, we look at providing real-world evidence and health economics research to support timely and critical informed decision-making. We can also support the expedited creation and development of study-level documents such as protocol amendments, ICF changes, investigative brochure updates that can be submitted on an expedited pathway to IRBs and IECs. And we also are experts in the authoring, editing, and submission of documents in the eCTV format and other electronic submissions, including emergency use authorization applications. So with that, I'd like to hand over to my colleague, Elaine Taylor, who will talk to you a little bit less about clinical operations, but really focusing on what is the downstream effect of some of these challenges on the regulatory filing strategy. Elaine?
Thank you, Demetrius. I'm going to talk to you about evaluating your regulatory filing strategy during COVID-19. So the regulatory topics that I plan to cover are a timeline of key events. We've all seen how quickly the regulatory agencies across the world have responded and the amount of work that's being done. It's simply incredible. For this talk, I want to focus on the EMA and the US FDA. Secondly, Demetrius, he's covered a lot of information about conducting your clinical trials during this crisis. I'm going to provide some regulatory perspective. I will also take a look at the COVID-19 fast track programs that have been instituted. This is important, not only because these programs are important for developing COVID-19 vaccines and therapies, but also because you can see the amount of effort that's underway by regulatory agencies and how many resources are being diverted to handling this crisis and developing and implementing these programs. Next, I'll discuss the impact of COVID-19 on other applications. There's been a lot of focus on COVID-19 applications and treatments, but what about your other applications? What are the regulatory authorities saying, and what have we seen? And then I'll discuss the potential impact on your submission and what mitigation strategies can be implemented. After that, we will take your questions. There's a lot to cover in 20 minutes, so let's get started. Looking at the timeline, you can see a lot's happened in the last few months. The highlights include the Department of Health and Human Services here in the US declared a public health emergency on January 31st. February 4th, the EMA came out with a guidance for sponsors developing novel COVID-19 treatments and vaccines. The EMA announced measures to support the availability of medicines during a pandemic on March 10th. WHO declared a COVID-19 pandemic then on March 11th. EMA responded on March 13th, saying any developers of medicines or vaccines for COVID-19 will benefit now from free scientific advice. So come to us and talk to us. On the same day, on March 13th, the US president declared a national emergency due to COVID-19. March 20th, both FDA and EMA separately issued a guidance on the conduct of the clinical trials during COVID-19. These guidances are different. They contain some different content, but they're also very similar. Both the EMA and FDA have updated these guidances many times since that first issuing. Other important events include the US FDA creating an acceleration program for COVID-19 treatments. It's an abbreviated program on April 1st called CTAT is the acronym. It's Coronavirus Treatment Acceleration Program. And then on April 9th, the EMA established their own task force to handle the development of COVID-19 research. On April 10th, EMA issued questions and answers on regulatory expectations of medicinal products during COVID-19. April 16th, the FDA said that they will continue their user fee-related reviews throughout the COVID-19. April 17th, an important partnership was formed with NIH and FNIH, which is a foundation for the National Institutes of Health. It's a nonprofit, independent, charitable organization. Our Health and Human Services, the FDA, and EMA, along with biopharmaceutical companies, to accelerate these COVID-19 therapies and vaccine development. We've seen other agencies across the world dealing with COVID-19 and announcing what they're doing, their guidances, clinical trials, fast tracking of information to get studies underway. You can see a lot's happened in the last few months. Demetrius talked about the guidance on conducting clinical trials. I'm going to explore it from a regulatory point of view. Both the US and EMA have issued these guidances, as I showed you in the previous slide. They've been updated several times, and I expect them to continue to be updated as this situation progresses. So what are the key messages and takeaways from these guidances? As with any clinical trial, safety of the participants is the most important aspect. One way to achieve this is to have an ongoing evaluation of the risk and to also document your assessment of those risks. You may decide to postpone starting a trial or continuing a trial based on your risk assessment. Some trials may even pose a greater risk to participants if you stop the trial, for example, some life-saving oncology agents. So lastly, be sure to keep your participants informed of any changes that are made. Both FDA and EMA have asked that you aggregate submissions. As much as possible, consolidate your protocol modifications into one protocol amendment. This will save the number of touch points for each of your changes and save valuable regulatory resources. The FDA and EMA have acknowledged that there will be more protocol deviations than normal. Important that you do what you can to minimize these deviations. They've noted that having more than one deviation in itself will not trigger GCP as it has in the past. That's actually the FDA that noted that. Deciding to pause screening or enrollment will not generally be a protocol amendment if it doesn't affect the safety, scope, or scientific quality of the study. Due to this crisis, there may be additional procedures required by local authorities. The FDA has said that these additional procedures do not need to be reported as an amendment unless you want to incorporate the data that these procedures that you get as part of your study objective. And then the audits. EMA has out and said that during this time, you should generally avoid or postpone audits. For COVID-19 trials, the CHMP in Europe has asked that the European sponsors pool research resources and conduct large, multi-center, multi-arm trials. They feel that these larger trials are more likely to generate conclusive evidence. I've got to, okay. So what is the expectation for notification of changes to your clinical trial due to COVID-19? In general, it's the same as it always has been for clinical trials and prior to this crisis, but there are some exceptions, and there's more explicit direction that has been provided by the regulatory authorities. Any changes that have been made to eliminate hazards and protect the well-being of participants can be implemented prior to the Ethics Committee and Regulatory Authority notification. However, you must report it subsequently to the FDA. The FDA will consider these changes that happen prior to approval or submission to be protocol deviations. Missing information. This can happen because you have participants not being able to show up for visits. You may have measurements that can't be taken at the planned time points, or patients actually dropping out. So what can you do? You have to document all of this information. Put the detailed information in the CRF and discuss it within the CSR. Plan for how this will be handled prospectively in the SAP before it is final. And consult with your regulatory authority. If you have changes to efficacy assessments, data management, or your statistical analysis plan, you may find that you can't complete the number of participants you've planned. How will this affect your efficacy endpoint? How will it affect the number of participants that are required for safety? Think about this, discuss it, plan for it, talk to the regulatory agencies about your decisions and how you're planning to address it prior to logging that database. Decide how all your changes and deviations related to COVID-19 will be handled. And of course, as Demetrius mentioned, all of this will need to be addressed in the CSR. You know, you've got to do a thorough listing of all the participants, the visits, the parameters, the laboratory values, you know, any of the measures that have been impacted. And then you also need to discuss the impact of these changes and how it may have affected the data or the results and the conclusions. I've seen sponsors that are reluctant to be critical and assess their own data critically, but it's important that you be as unbiased as possible. It's better for you to present your position to the agency than have them come to their own conclusions. I somehow scrolled down too far. Let's see if I can rectify that. Okay, my next slide. Fast Track and Emergency Use Program for COVID-19. As of April 1st, the FDA announced a coronavirus treatment acceleration program called CTAP. Many of you may already know this. This program's been set up to provide ultra-rapid review of programs and protocols for studies to evaluate drugs and vaccines for the treatment of COVID-19. Under this program, the FDA will triage requests within 24 hours, and in certain cases, they'll also provide ultra-rapid review of a protocol within 24 hours. They prioritize these requests based on the scientific merit, the stage of the development, and if they identify it as a possible priority. There have been more than 950 requests the last time this was updated on April 16th. So I'm sure that number is much higher now, that we're 10 days plus past that date. We have found that what the sponsors want you to do under this program is to submit a pre-IND meeting request with the meeting package. The FDA will review these requests, and they're trying to respond to these requests on these meeting packages within 2 weeks. There's also the emergency INDs and expanded access programs for patients that cannot participate in a clinical trial. The FDA may authorize the use of some investigative drugs by telephone within hours when it's needed. As of April 17th, there were more than 500 studies for COVID-19 listed in clinicaltrials.gov. 1 week later, on April 24th, I looked at it, and it was 902 studies. So there are a lot of studies out there being run. 25 of those have already been completed, and there's 400 actively recruiting. As of April 19th, the last day it was updated, under the CTAP program, there were 72 active trials, and there were 211 in the planning stage. The EMA programs. The EMA announced the COVID-19 Pandemic Task Force on April 19th. Much like the CTAP program, this program will review data identify promising candidates, and then they'll engage with sponsors and offer scientific advice to aid in getting the clinical trials underway. They will provide feedback when formal scientific advice isn't feasible. The EMA also has a compassionate use program for patients not eligible for clinical trials. Remdesivir was made available for compassionate use on April 3rd, and there are more than 90 studies listed in the EU clinical trial database for COVID-19 on April 17th. As of April 24th, there were 122 listed. Okay, so what is the impact of COVID-19 on current applications or the other applications that you're working on? On April 1st, the FDA announced that it had reduced some of their operations. These included on-site foreign inspections and some advisory committee meetings. In addition, they did cancel or postpone all non-essential meetings through the month of April. For example, the pediatric committee meeting, that was canceled. We have seen some advisory committees, they've been announced, these advisory committee meetings that were postponed. Intercept, their NASH drug, their advisory committee meeting has been delayed for 2 months. It's now scheduled for June 9th. It has a target action of June 26th. This leaves only 3 weeks from the advisory meeting to an action date. Normally, there's at least 6 weeks between the two. So that's going to be a rush to action. The GlaxoSmithKline, their Trelegy drug, that was postponed until further notice. So that has not been rescheduled yet. It had been scheduled to happen on April 21st. DBV Technologies, their peanut allergy patch, their advisory committee meeting was canceled. The note said that it was to allow FDA to review outstanding issues, and it will schedule it in the future. It had been planned for May 15th. On April 16th, the FDA said their user fee-funded reviews are all on schedule. Dr. Hahn, however, the FDA commissioner, did state that the FDA may not be able to continue at their current pace. And I think we can see why when we look at all the programs that they're dealing with. I did take a look at what was being reviewed and what has been reviewed to kind of get an idea of, are we seeing a downturn? But it doesn't appear there is. You can see the numbers in March of 2020. There were 436 supplemental and original applications on which there were actions taken. In 2019, there were 268. Up to April 23rd in 2020, there were 411 supplemental and original actions that were taken. In 2019, the number had been 439. So as you can see, it does appear that the approvals so far are on target, but we're not sure if this is going to continue. We have observed with some of our clients Type B meeting requests that were submitted in April, say late March, early April. We've seen them scheduled out 3 and 4 months later than the expected 60-day meeting date. Of course, and these meetings were scheduled as telecons instead of face-to-face. So looking to the European medicine agencies, it's assumed that the EMA will prioritize their work as they did when they moved from London to Amsterdam. They'll keep their MAAs, their new indications, their risk assessments at the top of agenda, and they'll deprioritize anything less essential. That's our expectation. Of course, they haven't come out and officially said that. I have looked at their assessment reports and what they did during March, and there were 7 of those in March that did come out. A year ago in March of 2019, there were 3 European public assessment reports. Of course, they don't have the data available for April yet. But some things we know they're doing in reaction to this crisis. On March 11th, they announced that they're holding all committee and working party meetings virtually until the end of April. and then on April 21st, they extended it to the end of May. April 10th, a measure was put in place to provide for continued availability of medicines. They're allowing now for greater flexibility in the manufacture and the distribution of products. Also on April 10th, a question and answer for regulatory expectation for medicinal products for human use were issued. This document provides a lot of information. Some key ones concerning applications were that marketing authorization holders may request a delay for the renewal of their application. But this, of course, this request must be put in prior to the deadline. Also, if the sunset clause is applicable for you, it's possible to request an exemption to this. So looking at the impact of your submission and what mitigation plans can you take, I've listed three main impacts here. Let's start with timelines. For sponsors, there may be trial delays. I'm sure you're seeing it due to COVID-19. There's going to be interruptions or changes to the clinical supply chain and distribution that may cause further delays. Also, we got to factor in the potential delays from regulatory agencies in their review and their response time to you. In order to plan for effects on timelines, be aware of the environment around you, what's happening in the regulatory agencies that are important to you. Monitor for those potential delays. Prepare for those delays with contingency plans. Identify what are the critical path items. Triage these as needed to maintain or recover your timeline. Work with data information, the data and the information you have available now to speed up your overall process at the end when that last piece of information is going to come in. Factor in potential delays from regulatory authorities and your own staffing limitations that may be affected. And then, of course, there's going to be the need for that additional documentation. Demetrius also covered this very nicely. Assess any impact on your studies and your planned submission. What documents are you going to need to update due to COVID-19? Those protocol amendments, the CSRs, your statistical analysis plans, your planned meeting packages. Are you going to now have to address COVID-19 issues? Your marketing applications. You certainly, if there's any effect of COVID-19, are going to want to address that. And in your marketing applications, be sure to provide that critical assessment of any study changes that took place during the conduct of your studies. And again, planning is going to be your best mitigation strategy. Start now, identify the areas requiring additional documents, outline or begin to draft now to reduce that turnaround time later. As mentioned before and suggested by both the EMA and FDA, aggregate those protocol amendments, reduce the touch points needed. And make sure your documentation is clear, concise, and accurate. That is going to make it easier on the reviewers. It'll generate fewer questions and will make things go a lot quicker and smoother. And at this time, we need all the help we can get to make things go quicker and smoother. Your discussion with regulatory agencies are going to be very important. Discuss the changes, present them to the agencies, gain agreement on your changes and the actions you've taken or that you plan to take. You know, schedule your regularly planned meetings for the particular stage of your product development. What mitigation strategies can you employ here? Again, planning is most important. Watch and plan for potential delays due to overload by the regulatory agencies. Pre-plan for your meeting packages and content in anticipation of your agency discussion. Evaluate and discuss the robustness of your clinical data in light of changes that you may have had to make. The regulatory agencies are going to want, as I said a few times already, a critical assessment from you on this. Submit your request for a meeting earlier than usual to ensure you get on the schedule and receive timely responses. Make sure your meeting requests and packages are well written, clear, concise, as I said, we're all in a critical time environment. These steps you take now will aid in overall efficiency and success of your program. Thank you all, and I wish you all to stay safe. I'll now turn this back over to Suzanne for the questions and answer session.
Great. Thank you so much, Elaine and Demetrius. As Elaine mentioned, we'd love for you to submit your questions to our panelists in the question and answer box. So we've got our first question. Demetrius, in the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned that endocrinology is the therapeutic area that seems to be most impacted by COVID-19. What do you think is the reason? Is it regulatory or scientific for that?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I'm not sure I have a definitive answer. I haven't done a full analysis of the data. My suspicion would be that endocrinology is an area where there's a lot of development activity that's occurred over the last 5 to 10 years, and so the standard of care is very well defined, and certainly there's options available for patients who are suffering from endocrinology diseases. So my suspicion would be that people are doing their own personal risk-benefit analysis and deciding whether to participate in new clinical trials, given that they may not be suffering from life-threatening diseases, as you would see, for instance, in the oncology space, where there may not be a first-line or second-line therapy available as an option. But I do suspect that there's just some operational challenges there, but I would need to further look at the data set to really evaluate if there are any regulatory challenges that are presenting.
Someone wants to know, is the CTAP program at the FDA for both small molecule drugs and biologics, or is it a CDER-only program?
That is a good question. I think it's for both. I do not think that they are separating them out at this time. Of course, when you have questions, they do, on the website, they do have different email addresses listed on the CTAP website, whether you're a medical device or biologic or you're going to CDER. So you will send it to a different address, your package or your question. And be sure to put COVID-19 in the header, or make sure that's a subject line.
Would you recommend adding COVID exposure risk languages to your informed consent forms?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting question because I think there's a lot of different layers that need to be addressed. So, this is now a known risk, right? So there certainly would be a risk profile section in the informed consent. And so as we start thinking about amendments to your ICF as well as to your protocol, there should be a discussion around what the potential impact exposure to COVID-19 may have on your participation in the study, so that the individual participant can make an evaluation regarding their continued participation in the study. The other interesting piece here is that you need to start thinking about what does that do for your analysis, and I think we touched on this throughout the presentation, is that there needs to be an evaluation as to seeing whether or not exposure to COVID-19 actually confounds your data analysis and creates additional factor you need to consider as to the efficacy and or the safety of the drug profile. So I think there's several parameters that need to be reviewed. What does it look like from your protocol perspective, your ICF, your statistical analysis plan, and then again, how are you addressing that COVID-19 exposure in the individual clinical study report and in your clinical overview for your marketing application. So there's a lot of layers here that COVID-19 are touching that's impacting the decision around participation in studies, but also the impact on the data set and the intent to treat population.
Thank you. What guidelines does the FDA use for remote clinical trial inspections?
Yeah, so, I mean, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think recently, maybe 2018, 2019, the FDA did release some guidance around risk-based approaches to monitoring of clinical studies. And they're quite broad, and it helps sponsors navigate the changes from a model that's more traditional of on-site monitoring to a bit of a virtual based or hybrid approach. So it's really looking at answering the questions about risk tolerance, how do you build your risk profile, what are the key indicators you should be looking at, but ultimately, how do you draw the correlation between what you're able to validate by being on site versus the data that you're able to view from a remote monitoring perspective. The underlying pieces here is two different things. I mean, there is remote monitoring, but then there's also centralized monitoring, right? So you actually have three different paradigms or hybrid approaches that you could take going forward. I mean, there is some risk-based monitoring, which is really focused on, for instance, source data verification versus source data review. That might be a type of risk-based monitoring, and that may not include any type of actual technology tool or platform being used. There could be an added additional layer of how you're using electronic medical records and whether or not you have access and being able to review certified copies and such. Then there's another layer here around if you're using tools that are aggregating data across the study from multiple sites at the country level or the regional level that allow you to do signal detection for adverse events, performance at the site, are there key safety or efficacy items that should be addressed. So again, those kind of tools are available. So there are guidance documents available that talks a bit about this, but again, there's varied approaches, and so you'll need to be able to, again, identify in your clinical monitoring plan the rationale for the strategy that you've chosen, how people have been trained on that approach, and how you've consistently been compliant with that revised approach as well in your clinical monitoring strategy.
Thanks, Demetrius. Elaine, someone would like to know, are the delays in meetings being granted, is that across all disciplines or for certain therapeutic areas? How far in advance would you recommend that a sponsor submit a request?
So as you know, there's been no formal announcement from the FDA that there are any delays. These were just experiences that we had that we had seen that there were delays. These were in the CNS and the oncology division. So, we don't know if it's across all divisions that they're seeing the same things. But, I think that you can expect that as the FDA is pulling resources, that something's going to have to give, as there's a lot of work going on. So that's really the answer. There was a second part to that, wasn't there? How far in advance would we recommend that they submit?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, we saw the delay of 2 months. So, I would say 2 to 3 months in advance of what you would normally submit. And when you submit, that doesn't mean, oh, gee, I'm really messed up if the FDA agrees to the 60 days. When in your request, you can tell them when you want to meet. So you may put, we don't want to meet until, the month of whatever that's 4 months later. So you can put in the request when you would like to meet with them. But I would plan on at least 2 months ahead of what you normally would submit. Of course, that means you have to plan farther in advance. And that may be difficult if you're waiting on data.
One of our attendees wants to know whether there's any harmonization of requirements for COVID-19 drug trials between the FDA and Health Canada, and are there any exchanges going on between Health Canada and FDA on this topic?
Well, as you know, the agencies around the world, these regulatory agencies all talk to each other, and I'm sure that Health Canada and FDA are continuing communications, especially on COVID-19. I haven't seen anything specific on Health Canada and FDA. I have seen a few specific communications about FDA and EMA, but that's not to say that they're not happening. I haven't heard of harmonization requirements, but as you know, Health Canada and FDA in the past have usually agreed. They seem to be diverging more in the last year or so, but I don't know the answer, actually, if there are any requirements. I haven't seen any, so I'm not aware. I can double check for you. I know that Suzanne has your email address. So if I find something, I certainly will notify you of it.
Fantastic. Someone wants to know, from your perspective, what could be the anticipated impact on the submission timeline, the 30 days, and review quality of new INDs sent to FDA's CBER division during COVID-19?
Well, I have seen an amazing job by the FDA. I just think, kudos to them for all that they've done. I think, as far as we are aware, they certainly will keep to those 30-day timelines, as much as possible. Even before COVID-19, though, I've had, and some of you may have also experienced it, that it went outside of the 30-day window. As I always say, when you submit your IND, you wait 30 days to start your trial. But don't just start your trial 30 days later. If you haven't heard from the FDA, because there's no regulation that they need to notify you, so a lot of people say, well, no news is good news. I like to still contact the FDA at day 29 or day 30 and say, hey, are we going to hear anything? Do you have any comments? And then they'll say, no, we have no comments. Or I've had them tell us, yes, we actually do have comments, and we'll be sending them to you within 2 days. So always check with the FDA on whether or not they're going to have comments. But at this time, I haven't seen delays for IND review.
Should all trials be assessed for fertility or impact on statistical analysis as an ethical concern?
Yeah, this is an interesting question, I think, because it actually raises a few different issues. I think the ongoing evaluation by sponsors as well as sites is to continue to look at the risk-benefit analysis for ongoing support and participation in the study. I think the difficulty or the question around should every study have a futility analysis, it's really a challenging situation given that if you've not built that structure into your statistical analysis plan and design the collection of data so that, for instance, an independent data monitoring committee can actually do an ongoing review of data, it's going to be a challenge to do that. Remember, if we're talking about randomized controlled trials, unless you're able to blind the data, you're not able to do an analysis against your primary or secondary endpoint. So these are questions that you'll have to ask is, is it worthwhile to review our statistical analysis plan? Should we amend the protocol? Should we employ a data monitoring committee to do this type of analysis? It's really going to be important. And one of the things that could be an outcome, as Elena suggested, is that, based on protocol amendments or based on requests coming back from the regulatory agencies, they may require you to do this type of analysis and have an unblinded team that can perform this type of futility analysis. Because again, the important question we're trying to ask is it that, we've now introduced another layer of risk and potential exposure to COVID-19. We don't know what impact that may have on the safety profile for the individual participant. And so if we're going to, continue to put patients at risk, are we going to get to the scientific answer that we're asking at the beginning of the study? And the answer is no, then there really questions whether or not we should continue the study. So this is something that has to be taken into, context at the individual sponsor level with a futility analysis, but something should be considered as part of the ongoing analysis to determine if the study should continue.
Great. Just wanted to mention that our audience has submitted a ton of questions, which is absolutely fabulous. We're going to answer as many as we can, but if we don't get to your question, we can always send you a response in writing. So someone would like to know, do we need to wait for approval of a substantial amendment from the EMA or MHRA to add a SARS-CoV-2 diagnostic test into a clinical trial that has been halted before restarting?
That's a good question.
Yeah, go for it.
Demetrius, I would say yes. I don't know what your opinion is on that, but I think yes. They have halted the trial, so there isn't any timing issue.
That's right.
You know, so I would say you could submit that for approval prior to restarting.
Yeah, I think the interesting part about the question is that the study has already been halted, right? So it was a study that was ongoing, and you felt like this was something where patients were at risk and there was an emergency need to assess exposure to SARS-CoV-2 strains, then, you know, there may be a pathway to say we'll begin testing ahead of actually having the amendment approved. But if you're already in a stand down or halted state, then I would expect that the agencies would anticipate any substantial amendments be reviewed and acknowledged before implementing and moving forward with restarting the study.
Someone would like to know, what type of COVID-19 studies are getting higher priorities than others under CTAP?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
So there's the CTAP program, and so someone would like to know, are certain types of COVID-19 studies getting higher priority than others? And if so, what type of studies are those?
The FDA hasn't announced, you know, how they're prioritizing the studies, so we don't have that information. Certainly, I know, you know, we've all seen antivirals are very high priority for the FDA at this time, but I don't know how they're prioritizing them.
What specific considerations would you recommend for initiating new trials?
Yeah, I mean, this is interesting because, I mean, it's a challenging environment to do initiating new studies, right? So you've got to do some site identification and site startup activities, and though many sites are constrained by their ability to be able to do that, so the timing may not be the best. I mean, but obviously there's some things you can do up front around due diligence and assessment. I think also it's important to, you know, submit the protocol and have some discussions with the regulatory agencies. You know, we can preempt any downstream protocol amendments by thoughtful protocol design as well as implementation of agency recommendations up front into the study. But it's a challenging environment, and certainly need to think about your statistical analysis and how confounding factors like you know, drug adherence, protocol deviations, you know, logistical concerns, stability of your IMP, logistics and things of that nature are going to be implemented. So I think a lot of the things that we talked about for ongoing studies, you have an opportunity up front with any new studies to really think about implementing strategies that will mitigate those issues.
Did the FDA issue any guidance regarding extensions for submissions around IND annual reports or IND updates?
I have not seen any extensions offered for any of those. Certainly, as you know, you can, if there are circumstances, notify your project manager, and I would talk to your project manager if you have issues or delays.
Great. This looks to be the last question. If the and it may need some clarification. If the sponsor does not want to have a pre-IND meeting and wants to submit the protocol for an investigational drug which is currently being studied for indications, the plan is to cross-reference M3 and M4 to an active IND. How do you proceed with that?
Could you repeat the question? I'm sorry. Could you repeat it?
Sure. The person who asked it may need to provide a little bit of clarification. So it sounds like they don't want to have a pre-IND meeting. They want to directly submit a protocol.
Oh, wow. Uh-huh.
Yeah. For an investigational drug. Yeah, you got it? Okay.
Yeah, so for an investigational drug, which is currently being studied for other indications, there is no requirement that you have a pre-IND meeting with the FDA. You can certainly go ahead and submit your protocol. If you want to, you're going to submit an IND. When you cross-reference a Module 3 and a Module 4 to an active IND, really, I hate to say it, but it depends, because I don't know what IND you're cross-referencing to. I don't know how your drug relates to that IND. So, this is a question that I would have to have more information in order to answer exactly. So if they want to supply us with more details, I certainly would be happy to answer the question.
Great. Thank you so much, Elaine and Demetrius, and thank you so much to our audience for attending this webinar and providing such excellent questions.
Yes, really. Thank you for those.
Yeah,
appreciate it.
Before concluding the webinar, we have a few short announcements. Our next webinar will be on May 6th when Drs. Jeff Barrett from the Critical Path Institute and Patrick Smith and Karen Rowland-Yo from Certara will present COVID-19, Building for Today and Tomorrow, Therapeutic Considerations for Children and Pregnant Women. On May 12th, Dr. Nastia Kassir will present FDA approval of oral testosterone replacement enabled by Phoenix NLME and Trial Simulator. You can register for all webinars in the series by visiting Certara.com. On behalf of Certara, I would like to thank you for attending today's presentation. This concludes the webinar. Goodbye and have a great day.